Hello and welcome to another episode of Cross-Checking, the only Lutheran podcast run by people who can't really ice skate. I know what I'm supposed to do, but doesn't mean I'm good at it. I'm Pastor Ben
How
Allschlager.
dare you assume I can't ice skate?
You grew up in Georgia, went to school in Tennessee, followed by Missouri, then ended up in California. I bet you look like me on ice skates.
And some gazelle of the ice. So whatever an ice gazelle is.
I was thinking a walrus, roughly equivalent to a walrus.
You know, it's a shame that this podcast is family friendly, Ben. Is all I'm going to say. That's a shame.
With me today, as always, is Pastor Josh Laborious, now coming to you from lovely Friendswood, Texas, though we've both received snow in the last 72 hours, so...
Yeah, but here's the beautiful thing.
Is yours gone already?
Texas is there's no snow left outside. In fact, the temperature outside right now is 54 degrees. It's still a little chilly, but you know what? We'll be in the 70s this weekend, so it's going to be okay.
I think we can just call you a wimp. That's fine.
You can. You are free to do so. Wouldn't be the worst. Wouldn't even be the worst thing someone's called me today.
It's fair. I had a dentist appointment this morning, and as I'm walking out, the receptionist at the dentist office goes, "Where's your coat?" I go, "I'm from Minnesota." And she goes, "Oh, that makes sense." Like, didn't even think twice.
Fair enough. None of this has anything to do, as far as I'm aware, with our conversation for today. As if you are new to the podcast, first of all, welcome. We hope that you stick around, and if we're not your cup of tea, we understand that as well. We get it. There are those who might call us an acquired taste, but you have so
like IPAs.
Season 7 of Cross-Checking, although this is season 1 of Cross-Checking. This is our 7th season as a podcast. We just changed the name. And if you listened in last week, what we kind of introduced our topic for this season, and that is we're going to be talking about, I mean, maybe the best way to describe it is just kind of practical issues that the church faces.
And specifically doing that through the lenses of the congregations that we serve. Because, we could touch on every practical issue that churches face in the world today, but we'll be frank.
No, let's say, no, we could.
Well, we could try, we wouldn't do it well, because our churches don't
have to be so general as to no longer be used.
Yes, and our churches don't face every challenge that's faced by churches across the United States or even across the world today. So
everything that's holy.
Yeah. So we're going to touch on the stuff that's most relevant to us, and if there are things that we don't touch on that you feel like we should, let us know in the comments or shoot us a message on Facebook. Come find us at our churches. Whatever's easiest, just let us know.
Yeah. We're happy to talk about things that we're not facing.
Yeah.
At our congregations. It's just, that's not going to be on the forefront of our minds. So,
absolutely.
That kind of introduction to what you're listening to out of the way. It only took us 4 minutes to even say the topic we're actually talking about. We're going to talk about ministry transitions. And this takes a couple different forms. I think the one that comes most to mind for me, especially because I just moved across the country, is when you have a transition in the professional church workers at your congregation. But some other significant transitions that have an impact on the identity of the congregation, you might have a facility change, whether that's a major building project or you move or something happens to your facility and you have to hunt and figure out what you're doing. That's another major change. But another major change that I don't know how much we're actually going to get into today, but it's a conversation worth having, is when the area around the congregation starts to change.
Mm.
And that's something we might spend a couple minutes on. That's a problem that people way smarter than us have been trying to lick, and to varying degrees of success, but more often than not.
I'm just going to vote now, and this is how informal our podcast is. I'm going to vote now that we make that next week's episode. So if you're interested in that topic of how to respond to changing demographics, we could spend a lot of time talking about that one.
We could, and people would have different opinions of how we come down on it. But you know what? we're not on here to make you happy. We're here to talk about what we think is good, right, and salutary. So,
Yeah.
not that we're trying to offend you. It's just if you're offended by
Well,
what we have to say.
Josh is speaking for himself there. I occasionally attempt to offend you.
That's, you know what, fair point. But we want to start with this transition of professional church workers, and we are gonna start with what is kind of our perspective on it, and we're gonna try and rein ourselves in because we know a lot of you listening, you're coming at it from the congregational standpoint, but we think
Mhm.
it's worth sharing kind of how do we see it, so that can kind of inform then how we talk about maybe what it could and what it should look like for a congregation. So if you don't mind, Ben, I'd love to start, seeing as I've just been through this ministry transition.
Yeah, I was gonna just turn it around and ask you a question if you tried to kick it my way. So,
Yeah. I have a book that we read in practical theology our fourth year that's been sitting in my office since I got here because I meant to read it and I haven't had time to. It's called A New Beginning for Pastors and Congregations. But when you get a new church and a new pastor, I think there are a couple things to keep in mind, and that is neither of you are coming in clean, if that makes sense.
mm,
So you are going to have, like, as a congregation, there are going to be some habits that are holdovers or traditions or whatever from previous church workers. And in the same breath, as a professional church worker, you're coming in with whatever your most recent context was. So a really easy example to illustrate that, where I was previously, for those of you who are familiar, I was most previously at Edgewater Lutheran Church, where I was the only full-time employee. And that meant for a lot of things, if someone was going to do it, I was going to do it, as far as things that you would expect an employee of the church to do. And here, there are several full-time employees. We have a director of youth, we have a director of children's ministry, we have a business manager, an office manager, a music director. We have all these different roles. So I'm having to unlearn this habit of, well, if something needs doing, I better start doing it because it needs to get done. And I need to kind of get in a better habit of seeing how are we going to work together, because it might not be my responsibility. It might be something I let Bruce or Krista or Robin, I let someone else down this hallway know, and they take care of it. So that's just an example of, you have to keep in mind, when you get a new church worker, they're coming from somewhere. And wherever they're coming from, there are going to be elements of that ministry that stick with them. And some of those are good, right? They might bring some cool ideas from another context that'll work well. But some of those are habits that they're going to have to break. And then the other big observation I have in this moment of transition, and this is something I don't know if everyone will do it, but this is going to be my approach. So if you're listening and you're from Hope Lutheran Church, first of all, welcome to the circus of this podcast. But also, I'm going to, as best as I am able, I'm going to spend the first 6 months to a year doing kind of more or less maintaining the status quo, in that I'm not going to try and radically change the direction of the church. I mean, I have my vision, and we're gonna start to align kind of what my vision is and what the church's vision is, and adjust both of those until we're at the same place and we're pulling the same direction. But I'm gonna learn what's the history. I'm gonna do my best to learn as much as I'm able. What's the history of the congregation? Where are you guys come from? What are the landmines that I should be careful before I step on? What are the things that are kind of universally a frustration? And you say, why would you look for that? And I was like, well, because those are easy wins. If there's something that's frustrating almost everyone in the congregation that I can do something about, that's something I can say, I'm going to do that. I'm going to take the easy win and kind of build up how the congregation thinks of me. Because for now, I'm kind of an unknown variable to a lot of extent. So I would like for you guys to understand that I'm competent. So look for easy wins, that kind of thing. But it is a lot of, I'm hoping to listen a lot. And that's not, I'll admit, that's probably not every pastor's approach when they're getting to a new ministry. But my thought is, if I'm going to effectively be a pastor, I'm going to effectively lead the congregation, I need to know the congregation first, at least to a certain extent. So coming at, what does a transition look like for me? for a professional church worker, because I imagine a lot of this is pretty similar for DCEs, for Lutheran school teachers, for music people, for other pastors. And then the last thing is a request, and then I'm going to kick it back to Ben here. I think one of the most valuable things you can do if you're considered, and this congregation was really good about it. They were. Um, and I think districts push this, is when you're bringing in a new guy, give them as much information about the congregation as you can, and maybe do a little bit of self-reflection on what bad habits maybe did you pick up while the last pastor was here, or what are some things where you're like, this has become a weakness for us? Because if someone can come in and say, this is a weakness for us right now, that's incredibly valuable information for a guy coming in who doesn't really know the lay of the land. And this is something staff, some of the members of the board of directors, even just some of the lay people have. You guys have come up to me here at Hope and kind of, not in a negative way, not in a demeaning way, just in kind of a for your awareness way. Let me know. Oh, just so you know, this is something that has happened in the past, and it turned out it was a major problem for us, or this is a habit we have as a congregation. So, like, Hope has been really good about giving me this information. That is something that if you are looking at a transition in your professional church orders, have an honest look at yourself and be willing to share that honest look with whoever is coming next. And honestly, you should probably do that before they accept the call, so that they actually know what they're stepping into. It doesn't help anyone for either the church worker or for the congregation to be dishonest when you're talking about a potential call or when there's a call on the table and you're having conversations. No one benefits if one of you is dishonest, because that just means, like, you're going to find out if you're stuck with it. So what about you, Ben? What's kind of, as you think about the transition from seminary to school, as you think about transitions in ministry, what comes to mind for you? What do you want to put on people's radar?
I think the biggest thing that, I kind of thought about and experienced transitioning into this call now 3.5 years ago was, I am not any of their previous pastors. And like, I came in doing some things that they weren't necessarily used to. They've gotten used to them over my 3.5 years here, but like,
yeah, there's a lot you have to get used to with Ben.
That's fair. But I think that's also something for congregations to be aware of, is that the new church worker that comes in, whether, again, pastor, youth worker, church musician, whoever they may be, you're going to have to learn their habits, because
not the same guys.
Yeah, and it might throw you for a bit. The way that, like, if you get a new church organist, the way that
Tempo
they
might
play,
be different.
tempo might be
Favorite
different
hymns might be different.
Exactly.
Patience with the choir may be different.
Yeah, exactly. All of these things are true. So just recognize as new people come in, hey, things are going to be different, and you have to be okay with that on some level. And that's also important to think about, and I think we can start to transition here. Like, I agree with what Josh said on a lot of things. We're not, in it to rock the boat right out of the gate. We're going to try,
unless there's like a serious issue.
Yeah, I was going to say, if there's a substantial change that needs to be made off the bat for the health and sanctity of the church, then that will be done.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
like if the church had, just because this is an example that churches have more often than they should. Like if the church has a really bad habit of everybody gossips about everybody else, that's one that, like, right out of the gate, it's like, guys, this is simple.
Yeah.
That's not a wait and see kind of thing. That's a, like, hey, we need to stop this.
Yep. But those early days are not meant to be, aside from just kind of the changes that naturally come with a change the size of staff turnover. That is a conversational period. It is a time for the two sides, the worker and the congregation, to get to know each other and figure out, what that relationship is going to look like for the glory of God. And
a better analogy than I really want it to be is, it's almost like when you're dating someone. And the first couple dates, you're just trying not to say anything too weird, getting to know each other a little bit. But if there are any red flags, you deal with those.
I would even maybe say it's like if you're meeting somebody that you're arranged in marriage to. Because, like,
You're
This
already
is
stuck together, I guess.
yeah, this is not something where you can just easily break up. You're committed at this point, so get used to it. Yeah, so transitioning from there, I think some of these kind of same themes can be applied to what you listening to this as a, I'm assuming that the majority of our audience is parishioners. I don't want to call you normal because you're a great people. Uh, Especially if you listen to this podcast, like that makes you
10 out of 10 human beings right there.
absolutely. Um, so
So you're not
uh,
going to call everyone listening normies?
no, definitely not. But if you are a church going person that is listening to this podcast, there might be some reasons that your church is going through transition, and Josh and I talked about some of those earlier. Facilities changing, staff is changing, some part of the ministry of the church might be starting or ending. A school starting or closing, a food bank starting or closing, whatever the case may be. As you go through that time of transition, we want to start to talk about some of the things that we think you should be aware of in that transition. And I think to me, the big one is grief. Like, whenever you make a change in any situation, you're going to have people who are grieving the loss of something that used to be there. And I read a psychology text at some point in seminary where it talked about grief as much as anything being about the perceived loss of opportunity as it was the loss of the thing itself, right? So when our family members pass away, what days often hurt the most? It's anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, those times where we wish we could have had another opportunity to spend time with these people and enjoy the traditions that we've picked up along the way. And I think some of the same things happen when, churches go through transition. People miss the things that they've become accustomed to that brought them comfort or joy or hope or, in a weird way, some of the things around like Good Friday and the Holy Week, where they remind us of our weakness, our shame, our pain, and our need for Christ, because good Christians do actually need those things from time to time. And we recognize when they're gone. We recognize when the traditions that help us in those ways are gone. So don't minimize the fact that people do experience grief over things that might seem on the surface kind of trivial. Yeah, Josh, you want to add anything to that?
Well, and I think from a congregational perspective, for those of you who are listening, that times of transition are beautiful opportunities for you to support your church community. Because Ben's right. You're talking about these. There is some grief associated with, especially if you love your pastor and he leaves.
Or if you had a big hand in building the previous, facility, or if you have a close connection to some part of a ministry that's shutting down, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, you have this. It is grief,
Mm-hmm.
and especially when it's other people that are involved, there can also be hurt there. Like maybe you feel betrayed because they left, or you feel at a loss because they retired, and now you're thinking about your own age, maybe, or something. Like there are all these emotions that are caught up with it, and some of them are incredible because you may reminisce and you might get a hit of nostalgia, and like there might be some of that as well. But in all of this, what an incredible opportunity for us, for members of the congregation, to minister to one another. And this would be something I would encourage if you're going through a transition. Spend more time together. Like say to the people around you, hey, do you guys want to, come over to my house and we'll have dinner together and we'll just talk about what were our favorite parts of ministry at the food bank, or this former youth person, or like whatever the transition is happening. Have those conversations of like, this is what I'm going to really miss, and allow space for it. And this is something I'm not going to miss. Like if your pastor's leaving and he had a nasty habit of preaching for 70 minutes at a time, you go ahead and say, man, I'm glad the sermons are going to be shorter now. Like, and then have grace with each other as you're sharing that, like support one another and say, and just be there and say, hey, at very least, you respect those emotions and where they're. And that's kind of a beautiful way that you can grow as a community during those times of transition when you support each other and you say, hey, especially if there's some unknowns on the other side, you say to one another, we don't know what's next, but we're here for you. We're here for each other. And I think that can be a profound thing for a ministry and for a community. And kind of another thing to keep in mind with transition that I think is just it's just a reality that we have to deal with these days, and you should be prepared for that reality. Vacancies are long. It's I was there was a buddy I don't remember who I was talking to. I was talking to someone, and his church was looking at getting I think it was an associate. It might have been a DCE, but their district president just point blank told them, he said, just so you know, that's an hour or a year and a half on the short end. Church workers of all stripes, there are just not enough of them to go around. And so, especially, if you're at a church where you only have your pastor and that's it, and you're looking forward to calling a new one, just prepare yourself for it to take longer than you think it should. And that's going to be really frustrating, and there are going to be a whole different set of emotions that come with that part of the transition. And here's the thing, that kind of frustration, it's not just with church workers either. Because a lot of us are used to either at work or at home where decisions can get made very quickly because you only have to talk to a few people, and then you just you go forward, you take the steps, and then you're done. Right? Like if you want to plant a garden in your backyard, you decide where you want to do it, you go to Lowe's, you get the stuff you need, you build the garden. Maybe you go back to Lowe's, get some more stuff, but a few weekends and your project's done. You're dealing with the church, everything especially with a lot of major transitions, these are decisions that are made by committee, which means you need volunteers, which means you need to find a time where all the volunteers can meet and meet again and meet again. So it's, even if it's not a worker transition, and you're like, oh, we're going to do a new building, or we're going to do a new ministry, or we're going to change how this ministry looks. Prepare yourself. It's going to take longer, especially and I don't mean this in any sort of negative way, but especially in smaller congregations. Because the way smaller congregations tend to be structured, not always the case, but they tend to be structured, is you need to go to the voters for more, or everything has to be decided by a board or two, and those kinds of decisions take longer. Whereas Hope is a larger congregation here, and it's policy-based governance. So there's a little bit less of that because as the senior pastor here, I have a lot of decision making. So I can say, we're going to do this, and as long as it's within certain parameters of our policy, we're just going to go to it. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of flexibility there, but when you're looking at transitions in the church, buckle up, they don't happen quickly. Mm-hmm. And that's Ben was talking about the grief and all the emotions that come with that, but as you're processing through it, there's also going to be this frustration about why is it taking so long? Why aren't we making the decision? Why aren't we taking this next step? And it's frustrating. I can't say anything here on this podcast that's going to be oh, it's not that bad. It's not fun. Mm-hmm. It's not fun to wait for things, especially important things. But important things take time. So that's another thing just to be kind of aware of when you're looking at congregational transitions.
Yeah. I think another good thing, anytime that your congregation is going through a transition, another thing to be doing is to just pray a ton. Looks like your world is shaken. That you were out of Earthquake Alley.
Furniture next door? I hope no one's dying over there.
Okay. We'll check on that later.
I will check on that.
But yeah, if your church is going through a transition, spend a ton of time in prayer for all of the reasons we've already talked about and more. Those are times of chaos usually, and the devil loves him some chaos. So it's an especially important time to be vigilant for ways in which your congregation is being stretched and pulled and attempting to be divided and all of these things because
Yeah, I've seen this practice, and I think I might start it up. And I got to give credit to one of our brothers in the ministry. I don't know if you've ever met him, but his name's Tim Steele. And before congregational meetings, so say they have a voters meeting on a Sunday, at least I think this is how he does it. They have a special service on Saturday. And it's just a prayer service. He comes in, there's no sermon. I do think there's a little bit of music, but it's largely just a service of prayer to pray for the meeting that they're going to have the next day. And I think that's a really cool thing to do. So yeah, Ben's exactly right. Be in prayer as much as you can. And if you can gather together and do that prayer kind of together, I think that has a lot of benefits, a lot of even additional benefits to just the prayer.
Yeah, I've not necessarily heard of that practice, but there are a lot of churches where before worship, elders will gather to pray with pastor, or some group of people gathers to pray before worship. I know at my congregation there's a prayer team that every week they gather to pray over a lot of the things that are coming up at our church, and whenever there's a voters meeting or any other large meeting for the church, they make sure that it's lifted up in prayer so that God is really guiding what's going on in those meetings. And yes, God does care about meetings. Meetings stink, but God still cares about meetings.
He does. Well, and not all meetings stink.
That's true. But meetings
Frankly,
often
it depends
stink.
entirely on who wants that. Well, not entirely. The subject, I guess, can affect
We'll agree to disagree on that one.
Fair enough.
And I'm not counting, like, grabbing coffee with somebody as a meeting. That's doing life together. Meetings are like, you're sitting down to go over
my last elders meeting was, we just got dinner, but it was, the elders are not a formal body here. It's just a group of guys that are gathered around to support me, and that's really cool. So we just had dinner to get to know each other a little better.
Nice.
Best kinds of meetings.
Yeah, I agree.
Another, if we're ready to move on. Yeah.
I got one more. Times with transit.
I have another one for congregational transition.
Okay, go for it.
I just want to make sure we didn't have anything else.
No, yeah, go for it. I'm good on prayer there.
The other thing that I think is worth adding with transition is, and I've mentioned this a little bit already, but it's gather information as honestly as you can until you're sick of it.
Mm.
From the perspective of someone who just transitioned, the more information I have about the congregation, the better off I am as far as making decisions about the call, about making decisions once I get here. Because if you want to do a call process and you're going through a district, as far as I'm aware, all districts will make you do a congregational self-study. Be honest with yourselves. Because if you aren't honest with stuff like that, then the worker that you are going to call they're going to be well suited for the congregation you lied and said you were, not the congregation you actually are. Okay? So you have to be on, and this is true, again, with all these sorts of transitions. Like if you're going to start a food bank, and that's the transition you're looking down, and you're like, oh, I'm sure we're going to give, and we're going to have the volunteers, and we're going to have blah, 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 blah. And you're dealing with an ideal, you're not dealing with the reality. Then after you've been running the food bank for a few months, you're going to be like, wait, we can't get the volunteers. We don't have the money we need. We don't have the donations we need. It's like, yeah. And if you had been honest with yourself when you were gathering information before this transition or in this transition, you would have been like, okay, we need to do some more groundwork here. So gather as much information as you can and be honest with it. Because you don't help anyone if you're like, well, I wish we were like this. You're not like that. And maybe you can find a guy who will help you get there. But that would be something you need to be honest about. You say, here's where we are, here's where we want to be, and we're looking for a guy to get us from point A to point B. Or we're looking for steps that are going to help us get where we want to be in regards to this ministry or this opportunity or the building, like whatever you're talking about. You got to be honest with yourselves and with anyone else who is speaking into the situation.
Yeah.
Honesty's the best policy, kids.
Yeah. I mean, that one's definitely hard when you're talking about, some of the big transitions we've kind of listed off in this episode, because honesty is hard to come by when there are deep emotional ties to a thing.
Yes. Well, and I think in some cases, honesty is scary because you're afraid. You're afraid of what the result will then be. And like
Mhm.
what is coming to mind immediately is if you are in a smaller congregation and you are honest on your paperwork about your worship and your Bible study and your giving numbers, I think there is a real and genuine fear that you won't be able to get a guy,
Mhm.
or that district is going to come back to you and say you are not in a position where you can sustain this position that you're looking. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you that that's not the case, because that is part of district's job, is to say, hey, you can't actually sustain a full-time guy right now. But the other part of district's job is telling you, but here are some other options that aren't a full-time guy that you could look into. And again, you got to be honest, because if you're not in a position where you can call a full-time guy, then it's good to look into these other options. And that's the same with a building project. If you're afraid, oh, if we're honest with ourselves, maybe we shouldn't do this. It's like, well, then maybe you shouldn't do this until you strengthen your foundation. Um,
Yeah.
but I understand the fear
Yep.
that if we're honest with ourselves, it's going to tell us something we don't want to hear. It's like, yeah, but sometimes you need to hear things you don't want to hear.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
Last thing that I want to bring up on stuff to touch on in congregational transitions is when you're in those times of transition, be aware of the opportunities that God is putting in front of you, because that is a great time to discern what God is calling you to next. Like when you have a good thing going, it can be harder to see the opportunities that God's placing in front of you. But when everything is kind of up in the air and in flux, that's a great opportunity to look around and go, where can we be creative? What kind of solutions is God maybe putting in front of us that we hadn't been aware of before, or hadn't been thinking about before because we just weren't seeing it? What does that maybe look like for us going forward? So, prayer, discernment, honesty, a lot of grace, and a lot of working with people through grief, all are going to be hallmarks of what it looks like to be a congregation going through transition. And I'm kind of wondering at this point, Josh, we're at almost 40 minutes in this episode. Do we want to call this good and come back in the next couple weeks with what it looks like as a church to respond to a world changing around you, and what it looks like as a person changing from one church to another, and make those a couple of different episodes?
yes,
All
yes,
right.
let's do that. Yeah, we'll make it into a little mini series within the season.
Yeah,
Because these are two topics that I think for you guys listening will be valuable for you.
yeah,
The world changing, but also like if and when you ever have to change a church, it's good to have some thought about that. So yeah, I think
absolutely.
those are both worth episodes on their own. I think you're right, Ben.
All right. Well, with that being said, then, what are we
Let's do
calling
our
these
empty
now?
netters.
Yeah, there we go. Taking some pot shots after the goalie's out. Just don't slap shot. That's how you get checked
Considered
in the
poor
head.
taste.
Josh, you wanna give us your shot at the empty net here?
I think my empty netter for today is just, folks, when you're going through times of transition, be self aware and be honest
Mm,
with yourself and with the people around you of where you're at emotionally, where you're at spiritually, where you're at with everything. Hiding that stuff, deceiving about that stuff doesn't help anybody. So that's mine. What about you, Ben?
I wanna riff off of yours for a second, then give you mine. I had a high school theology teacher who said cheating on a memory test when we had memory verses is like kicking a puppy. They're both real bad, so just don't do it.
That's a sentence I didn't think I was going to hear today.
So I've used that in confirmation class, like cheating on a confirmation quiz or first communion quiz is like kicking a puppy. Just don't do it. It's real bad. If you're a church that's trying to figure out what your next steps in life are, don't lie.
It's bad.
It's bad.
Okay.
Just don't do it. Yeah. So that's just backing up what Josh said a little bit. But then the other thing is, my empty netter here is, when you're going through times of transition, they will be difficult, but they're also full of incredible opportunities. And if you focus on just all of the hard stuff and all of the bad stuff that comes with transition, you will miss where God is showing you his hand and the opportunities in front of you. That might be more hard stuff, but if it's God leading you into a new direction, it's going to be for his glory. And that's an important thing to keep in mind.
In other show news, by the way, folks, I think I've decided what we're going to call our listeners, because it seems like podcasts these days have a name for their listener base. Welcome, beauticians. And
that might take more explaining than you want it to.
It's a hockey slang term. Just look it up. And if you're a subscriber, you're a registered beautician. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Season 7, Episode 2 of Cross-Checking. We're so happy you spent some time with us today. Go ahead and like the podcast, subscribe to us if you want. You want us to be showing up in your feed on whatever podcasting platform is your preference. We're on all the big ones. And if you think this is a helpful podcast, if you thought this episode was helpful, go ahead and send a link to one of your friends. Or maybe for you it wasn't super helpful, but you know a friend whose church is going through a transition and it might be helpful to them, go ahead and send it along. If you have any
We're not
questions,
entirely above shaming people either, so if you think you've got a friend that's like not doing it well, send it to them too.
Yeah.
And if they get to this point of the podcast and they figure out that that's why I got it sent, then like, get ready for a heart-to-heart.
Yeah, which is good. Probably. Hopefully. Yeah. I don't remember. If you have comments, questions, concerns, you can comment on the podcast. We'll see that. If you know either of us personally, you can reach out to us. You just shoot us a text, whatever. Or we do have that Facebook page that gets checked from time to time. So with all of that, blessings on your weeks. Brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.